Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Value-Based Payment Practice Transformation Academy's second webinar, Defining Your Stretch Project. My name is Libby Ethier, and I will serve as your moderator today. I'm a project coordinator at the National Council for Behavioral Health and for the Practice Transformation Academy. Before we begin, I'd like to bring to your attention that the webinar slides are currently available for download via the webinar navigation bar under Handouts. The slides and recording will also be made available on the Academy website within 48 hours. I am joined today by my colleagues from the National Council, who you may remember from the in-person workshop, Kate Davidson, Assistant Vice President, and Samantha Holcomb, Project Director. We'll be engaging in some discussion throughout the webinar today, so when the time comes, we encourage you to use the hand icon in the navigation bar to virtually raise your hand if you'd like to speak. We will then unmute you. You can also submit questions and/or comments throughout the webinar via the question box, which is also located in the navigation bar. And now I'd like to turn it over to Sam.
Thank you, Libby, and thank you everyone for joining us today. If we can go to the next slide. So today our purpose is really going to be building upon the work that we started with the in-person meeting that we had in October. And I want to just level set a little bit with you guys that many of the things that you'll be doing will be an iterative process, and as you test and refine approaches, because of this, we're going to be continually returning to some foundational elements that we discussed at the in-person meeting. So there will be some things that we draw your attention to today that are going to be refreshers, reminders. It's just because, and we said this at the in-person meeting too, everything ties together, and we want to be consistently going back to those key messages. I also want to do a little setting of expectations. You know, I really would love this discussion to be as interactive as possible. Obviously, I have plenty of slides. I can sit back and talk, but I have Kate with me as well, so I'm inviting her to interrupt me as she sees fit. And I'm also inviting all of you to do the same. We do have some set discussion sections built into the slides, but I think the way that this will work best is if you have questions while we're talking to, feel free to raise your hand, feel free to interrupt me. I want to really open this as an opportunity for you guys to be asking the burning questions that you have and getting them answered so that you're not leaving here with anything unanswered. So today we're going to go through quite a few things. We're going to, as I said, be building upon what we started in the in-person meeting. So we're going to continue to refine your logical framework. And I think all of you who have submitted them, they look amazing. But it's, like I said, going to be an iterative process as we talk through all of the next steps. We're going to talk about clarifying your stretch goal and your stretch project. We're going to dive deeper into defining your metrics and your data collection processes. And talk a little high level around planning for your stretch project. There is time built into subsequent webinars to dive deeper into that, but we're going to set the framework for that here, and then touch a little bit around implementing rapid cycle change. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So our work together from now until January is really that you're walking away with a clearly defined stretch project and a plan of the work that you'll be doing to accomplish it and how you're going to monitor and track progress. So I really wanted to reiterate, when we talk about a stretch project, this is really a focused short-term initiative that's building your capacity to implement larger scale change. We want this to be a stretch. We want it to be something you're not currently doing and, a big change within your current organization, but it also needs to be feasible and measurable. So when you're thinking about your stretch project, these are really the critical components you want to be asking yourself. Is it tying to readiness for value-based payments? And we're going to look at some of the themes we're already seeing from the log frames, but we are really seeing a lot of things that are tying to domains 1 and 2. We're going to be marrying project management and quality improvement skill sets with these, right? You're going to be planning them, implementing them. They're going to be really tied to quality improvement, but there's management skills that you need to be incorporating into that for success. It needs to be tailored to your organization. So looking at your organizational needs and how you can structure this stretch project to help fit some of those needs and address them. It's going to help you leverage a team approach to transformational change, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. it really needs to articulate a concrete goal, though, and have tangible outcomes. That's going to be critical for this. You're going to need a lot of organizational and team buy-in. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you can't articulate what your stretch project is and your stretch goal, it's not going to resonate with others.
I think that speaks to also why we want to make sure we go back to the foundational elements of all this too. So if you remember when we were in Washington, Sam, we talked about 7 times, 7 ways. You must communicate 7 times in 7 ways. So when we say something more than once, it means that it's important. And so this is how you communicate to your staff as well. You know, maybe they might not hear it the same way the first time, so you have to continue to reinforce your messaging.
Definitely. All right, next slide. So if you remember this slide from the kickoff meeting, we talked about types of change. And what I'm going to say now is your stretch project in and of itself is not going to be full-scale transformational change. Instead, it's likely to be a mix of developmental or transitional and maybe some transformational in nature as it goes through its cycles and you continue to refine it and improve it. But what it really is going to be one intricate part of a larger transformational plan. So our goal here is really starting small and building. You're familiarizing your team with quality improvement, rapid cycle change processes that they're going to need to adapt to for a larger scale transformation. You're testing and refining the messaging you're bringing to your team to obtain buy-in and clearly articulate their roles and responsibilities through the communication and stakeholder engagement of your stretch project that you're going to need to do for your larger scale transformational plan. So this is kind of a testing zone too. And you're also just building their tenacity through small wins and accomplishing your stretch project goals to build momentum for larger change. And so, you know, we'll be touching on larger scale planning and subsequent work together. At the end of this, we'll talk and forecast a little bit about some of the tools that we'll be providing for this. But when you're thinking about this stretch project in particular, we're thinking about this as a starting point for launching something much bigger.
When I think of these different types of change, Sam, one of the things that you know, if we're focusing on developmental and transitional, one of the marked differences between the two is that for developmental, you already have a system in place and you are tweaking it to make improvements. Mm-hmm. For transitional, you've identified that you have a system in place or you don't have a system in place and you are throwing it out and starting with something brand new. And so those are, and the reason why that's important is because there are 2 different approaches for how you are, how you're going to be able to actually implement any of those changes. And so you want to be clear with yourselves about, is my stretch project better defined as developmental or is it transitional, with an eye toward a longer term transformational change.
Great. So bringing you back again to these guiding questions that we're going to continue to ask over and over and over again. What is your stretch goal? What are you trying to accomplish? What is your North Star? In order to know where you want to go, this needs to be well defined. Who are you including on your transformation team and why? So who are the key players you need at the table, not only for political support, but also to accomplish what you're trying to do? How are you defining and measuring success? So without metrics, you don't have the ability to track on progress and course correct. And so this is going to be really key, not only for this stretch project, but metrics are going to be something that you're hearing over and over and over again as you're planning and transitioning into value-based payments. And what are your anticipated barriers? And the key here is really knowing and understanding these is essential to planning and being able to mitigate for them. Next slide. All right, so looking at proposed stretch projects, we kind of just called out some key themes that we're seeing across all of the logical frameworks that have come in. Really, many that we're seeing are around establishing a risk stratification process, establishing care pathways, both of which tie to a lot of what we talked about in terms of population health management in the kickoff meeting, reducing avoidable utilization, whether it be ER, hospitalizations, or readmissions, and improving screening and management of depression. And I think that what I'm seeing here is all of these are really well aligned with domains in 1 and 2 around financial sustainability and care delivery redesign. They're more trending towards care delivery redesign, but I think that's critical for the financial sustainability component.
You're referring to the Healthier Washington.
Yes, in the Healthier Washington. one thing I want to reiterate to you as you are thinking about your stretch project and as you're looking at and refining your logical framework and you're really defining what your stretch project is that you need to be able to succinctly define something that you can communicate with your team. So when you're talking about that, it's what do you want to achieve? What is your goal? And how are you going to achieve it? And together, those really compile what your stretch project messaging is. So it's not preparing for value-based payments. That's too broad, and it doesn't tell anybody or give anyone any information about how we're doing this and what their role might be or how things might change as a result of it. So we really want to narrow down, for example, just drawing off of some of the things that we saw with the logical frameworks. Say your goal is reducing 30-day rehospitalization by 25%, which is great. It's concrete, it's measurable. You probably want to throw in a time frame in there just to make it really smart. But then it's also marrying that with the how, right? How are you doing that? There's many ways that can be accomplished. So in order to really define your stretch project, the achievement needs to be there. So through an established systematized approach to linking discharges to a care manager. That's telling your team, this is the approach we're going to take to drive this clinical outcome. Or, reducing no-show rates by 35% within the next year. And then the how could be, revision of your operational workflows to support appointment processes. So those things together are really going to be what defines your stretch project. The thing that you really want to have on hand, I think, is an elevator speech, like a two-sentence summary that tells people what we're going to accomplish and how we're going to do it. And then we get to drill down into the actualities of the how when we start planning. Next slide. All right, so thinking about planning, and we're going to start working through some of these things, but it's really a cyclical process, right? We need to first define our goals and objectives and metrics, what we're going to do, how we're going to achieve it, and how we're going to measure it. And once we do that, then that lends itself to the activities that we need to do to lead to those results. And once we do that, in a perfect world, it would be, these are my goals and objectives. This is how I'm going to attain it. You do it, and the outcomes work perfectly. And the reality is that there's going to be testing and refinement. Not everything goes as planned. We all know that. We're all used to it. So it's kind of this rapid cycle change process that we're going to be working through with these stretch projects, right? We have metrics that can track on how we're progressing through our stretch project and our stretch plans. And we should be monitoring and evaluating that process. So as we're going through, we're doing rapid cycle change. We're looking at our metrics and the data that we're collecting, and we're understanding if this is working or if it isn't. And if it isn't, then we dive deeper and try to understand why, and then we come back to the drawing board. And luckily, we've had our metrics to track on so that we don't get to the end of a year-long, initiative and say, oh, this didn't work at all. Now we're starting at square one. Next slide. So let's start by bringing it back to your log frame. We started these during in-person meeting. Everyone submitted their log frames. Many of you have done a lot of work on them since then, and we really want to talk about that today, help clarify or refine anything you need. So if we go to the next slide, just pulling it back to here, looking at how you're defining your project results, your project deliverables, and your horizontal logic. So the key things that we want to talk with you about today is, how you've defined these pieces, what challenges or barriers you're having, what data sources we're starting to think about and work through them with you. So if we go to the next slide. So I really want to open it up now for discussion. Just looking at all the work that you guys have done, I know there's been a lot of progress. It seems like there's probably still a lot of people who are working through them. Maybe you've brought them back to your team. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you've just worked on them internally. While we're talking through a lot of things, I think the key that we want to be preparing you for is like looking to the future as we're doing these things. And we know that one of the next big pieces and one of our next webinars is about communicating the why and how you're facilitating buy-in and how you're engaging with your team. And so we want to be sure that you come to your team with a really solid logical framework and solid stretch project to talk to them about and reiterate and refine. So I really want to open it up to discussion now. We have a few questions on the board that we'd like to talk through, but we also have a poll, which really focuses on the challenge. So I think we'll start with the poll just to get people weighing in, and then we can see where the conversation goes from there. Libby, would you read the poll?
Sure. So what challenges are you experiencing in developing your log frame? Agreeing on an area of focus, establishing a stretch goal, breaking the goal down, defining metrics, or identifying data sources. We'll give you a few seconds to fill that out.
Answers are still coming in. Breaking news. All right, I think we can.
I'll go ahead and share those results here. So it looks like the two biggest areas are breaking the goal down into measurable outcomes and defining metrics that accurately measure progress, but we do have a distribution across all of them.
Yeah, it looks like there's another one that's in a close third is identifying data sources. What's interesting about this and not surprising is that, so we have a academy, National Council runs an academy nationally and then in the state of New York, and these directly mirror the same results that people are struggling with across the country. And so I just, I say that because I think it's, first of all, I think that it's really helpful to have an idea of where people are really putting their efforts, but also I think that it's important to notice that, that this is something that people across the board in behavioral health are really kind of working through, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yep, agreed. Does anyone want to share kind of their thought process or questions around those challenges, around, you know, with data or metrics or with the outcomes pieces, what you're grappling with?
And again, if you just want to raise your hand, there's on your GoToMeeting, it has you can raise your hand and we can unmute you there.
Yep. Another option is if you're shy, which please don't be shy, we're all friends here, is that you can type into the chat box as well and we can reiterate.
You know, as you're thinking about your metrics, going back to what Sam hit on earlier with the Healthier Washington Toolkit, thinking about where the state is going and what the whole goal of VSRIP is in your state, and so wanting to align what your process measures are with the state's outcomes as well. So that's a nice place to start, backing it up around what the expectations are going to be as a provider. And making sure that the work that you're doing within your logic model, within your stretch projects, are really aligned with those metrics as well. Anybody raising their hand?
Nothing yet.
We got people that are shy today, but we should we come back to this, Sam?
We will. I think, you know, at any time, if you decide you want to raise your hand, please do. I think it actually triages nicely into what we're going to be talking about next, which is measuring success.
Look what we did there.
I know. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So defining your metrics. What I'm going to say is your log frame is really only as good as the indicators and metrics you select and the data you're able to capture, right? Because if you're not able to actually have data that supports your outcomes and your claims, then you're not going to be able to tell a story or prove anything. So the way in which you can really look at your log frame is by breaking your metrics into kind of process and outcome related metrics. And I put these little boxes in here because those process metrics will really be tied to some of the activities and outputs that you highlight in your log frame, and the outcomes will really be tied to those objectives and goal level. So if we go to the next slide, the way we really think about this is the process measures are really tied directly to the work that you do, and the work that you do directly controls the results of these metrics, right? So when we're thinking about process metrics, and if we're thinking about risk stratification, it's looking at, okay, tied to my activities and my outputs, it's looking at percent of high-risk people who were referred to health home or care coordination, or percent of high-risk people who were seen in the last 2 weeks. It's that tangible work that you're doing. Whereas the outcome measures they're really a result of that tangible work, right? If we're thinking about, again, risk stratification, and we're looking at some outcome measures, thinking about the percent of people who improved from high risk to low risk in 6 months because you were able to incorporate activities that drive improved management of those who are high risk. And so if we go to the next slide, when you're thinking about defining those metrics, there's really some key criteria that we should be looking at. And so this is one of our favorite slides because it really helps us define what a good metric is. And I know a lot of you have put indicators or built out indicators within your logical framework, but I would really encourage you to vet them against this criteria, right? So if you're looking at your proposed metrics, one of the key things you should be asking yourself is, A, are they actionable? Are they a clear indicator of your success? If you're not seeing results to them, is it clear that there are actions or steps that can be taken to address this challenge? Are they accessible or credible? So you could craft the perfect metric on your own, but if you can't access the data you need for the metric, or if you can't find a way to collect that data, or it lends itself to risks or errors or misinformation, then it's not really going to be useful for you. So the credibility of your metric is key. It should have a common interpretation. So I think one of the things that everybody's grappling with is knowing what data to collect, and knowing or having guidance on, like, okay, but what if I collect the wrong metrics? What are people looking for? So when you think about common interpretation, it's knowing what metrics are already being collected out there. I think that, national standard measures are always a great place to start, HEDIS or NQF measures. However, many of you are probably going to be developing your own process measures as well, because your activities are going to be different, your outputs are going to be different. And so if this is the case, there's kind of two levels of this. There's a common interpretation between you, between a payer, between a larger scale, but then it's also between you and your team, right? You need to ensure that your team clearly understands the data you're asking them to collect, or you're risking miscommunication and misinterpretation by all parties, which could mean that your data might no longer be credible. So it's really important to make sure that not only you understand what your measure means, but that your team does, and they know how to collect this data, and they know what's expected of them. They understand what the numerator is, what the denominator is. Transparency and simple to calculate. So kind of building on that, metrics can take many forms when you're collecting data. So I'm thinking of, for projects that we're currently working on, we're using HEDIS and NQF measures and pulling them from a data warehouse, a Medicaid data warehouse. And we're incorporating a lag time to ensure kind of accuracy and completeness of that data because it's tied to claims. These measures are also available to our participating organizations in more real time on a statewide database as well. And since that database doesn't have lag time, the data looks different. And a huge challenge that we had at the onset of this project was really walking people through what the differences in this data is. It's coming from the same source. It's the same measures. Why does it look different? And, once we were able to talk about that and talk about the differing methodologies and why we're using those, then people got it and they understood it and they really liked it. But, overcoming that barrier and making sure that people understand that is critical.
No, I mean, I think it helps. I think that one of the big things here is when you're working with staff is that it resonates for them that it's going to help to improve their work as well. And so that's something that they are bought into and are excited about measuring. When I was working in clinics, one of the steps that we were taking in order to improve outcomes was really trying to improve engagement for high-risk patient populations. And so we weren't just looking at hospitalization rates. We weren't just looking at, critical incidences and medication adherence, but instead we were looking at process measures like what is the amount of time between the intake in session 1 and session 1 and session 2. And we knew that if we could reduce the amount of time between session 1 and 2 and 2 and 3, that we were probably going to have a better outcome at the end of the day. staff were brought into that, and we came up with a goal. We identified a metric and came up with a goal. And the reason that staff were brought into it is because they could see the link between reducing time between sessions up front and improved outcomes for a very high risk and a very high-risk patient population that they were worried about, because they cared about their patients, they cared about their clients, and so they really wanted to make sure that they could improve their practice. And so for that reason, they were really bought into that as a metric. And it made my life a lot easier because it was something that I had joint buy-in from everyone across the board within the clinic, and everybody was really excited about being able to demonstrate their progress.
Mm-hmm. Anyone have any questions on this or metrics that they're grappling that they'd want to throw out there? All right, next slide, please. So you might remember this from the midpoint meeting or the in-person meeting too. So I think my key takeaway here too is we're talking about good, valid metrics, how you're measuring success, but really a good metric is no good if you don't have a way to collect the data, right? So if we go to the next slide, what we want you to start thinking about is your data collection process. And there's some guiding thoughts that we have here that we'll walk through, but I think, the real need is to drill down into systematic processes to use data and need for overt workflows to identify roles and operationalize policy and procedure. So when you're thinking about your data collection plan, so as you've built out your log frame, you have your metrics, the next step is really, how am I getting this data? I'm always going to encourage you to start with low-hanging fruit. What are you already collecting? There could be data you're collecting that you don't realize. So that is the multifaceted process, right? You could be pulling from different staff members to understand what's the data you already have. How is that data useful, or how does it tie to what you're looking to do? What data could you easily collect? I've been reading a lot of articles lately and talking to a lot of people about how we are leveraging technology. So thinking about if there's data that you could easily incorporate into data collection through your EHR or through some other process. Identifying what other data you need to collect. So what are the measures or metrics that you might have identified that you think really soundly help you track on progress and measure success that might not be your easiest, but that you really think are critical to collection, and starting to think through the systems and processes that might need to change as a result of that. I will also say here that, with the Medicaid Transformation Demonstration Project Toolkit, there are predefined metrics for reporting for each domain, and these should be really a guiding point or a priority for inclusion, because you already know that these are the metrics that the state is going to be looking for.
We do have a comment and a question. Great. So Christopher says that one of their goals is to create a registry which identifies the top 20% of high needs, high utilizers, and the staff are asking about how they can identify what a high need, high risk population is versus a high utilization population. Mm-hmm. And so that is the whole question. We do a lot of work in supporting organizations to develop a risk stratification process, and that's in a few minutes, we're going to talk about the upcoming affinity calls, and a number of folks have identified risk stratification as one of their goals for their stretch project. And there's a lot out there, and we can send this out to the group too, around how people are what indicators people are just using in order to develop their algorithm. And I think they're hitting on something that's important. It's not just hospitalization and ED visits. There are other indicators like last time someone was seen within your clinic. There's indicators around medical comorbidities based on diagnosis, medication adherence. There's lots of different indicators that you can use, but one idea about how to get staff buy-in around this is to ask them the same question that you just asked us. What do you think are the indicators for you within our clinic that help you to identify when you have a high-risk patient or high-risk client? Because those, one comment that I hear day in and day out when I'm working with organizations is, well, our clinicians know who the high-risk patients are. They know who our high-risk clients are. And so many times your therapists or your prescribers hold the keys to that castle, and then it becomes an avenue to get staff buy-in about the data that you're collecting. And so they really feel validated that they're part of the process instead of having an algorithm that comes from on high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, building on that too, it's if they know those people, what are the commonalities between those patients, right? And chances are there is a lot of them. So thinking about it that way and working a little bit backwards. I mean, the other thing too is thinking about when you're looking towards value-based payments, knowing what your payers define as high risk or who they're concerned about as well. I think it's always looking at your multiple audiences and incorporating information from all of them.
It's a very good point.
That's a great question. And like Kate said, we'll talk a little bit more about affinity groups at the end. I think there's going to be a lot of really good discussion then on those calls. Okay, so developing a comprehensive implementation plan. So after you identify your metrics, after you identify, what data you need to collect, really thinking through the workflows and processes that need to happen in order for that to happen. And then finally, clearly communicating responsibilities and protocols. Chances are that things are going to change for your staff, not only from like a data collection standpoint, but, as we're talking about quality improvement, is how we're incorporating that data into the day-to-day and thinking about it and analyzing it across the board as a team. And so I cannot underscore enough communicating the why to everybody and the how this is going to change, not only as an organization, but for them as a staff member individually. Next slide, please. So opening it back up for discussion, key things that we're really wanting to talk about a little bit is, what metrics you're planning on collecting. What your potential challenges and barriers are. I can tell you, Kate said, we've been working on similar types of programs, both nationally and within New York State. And we've had a lot of these discussions in various formats. So I can guarantee that challenges and barriers are pretty similar across the board. And then this is really a prompt for you to start thinking about what is your data collection process starting to look like? And the key questions that you should be thinking about is, who's going to pull the data? How often? How will it be shared? Who's responsible for using it? And does it change any current workflows? And those things are really going to be an intricate part of your planning process then when you're starting to plan the activities of your stretch project. So we have another poll that Libby will open up.
So you should see it on your screen now. The question is, what challenges or barriers do you anticipate experiencing when collecting data for your stretch project metrics? The answers are timeliness and accuracy of data, establishing new workflows and processes, technology, and staff buy-in. And we will give you a few seconds to fill that out.
This is one of the most important pieces here, right? Because data is only as good as the people who have it in their hands. One of the things that is a struggle ongoing is when people receive data from someone else that measures their effectiveness in work, or it's a perceived measure of their effectiveness. And so one of the things that I like to consider as a former administrator was, how do I ensure that the therapists who are working with the client have access to their own data and pull their own data so that it really supports empowering them to change their practice as well. So that's a helpful consideration, I think, too, so that you're not the one who's really housing all of that information, but instead it's disseminated across your organization and your clinics.
I'm going to close that poll and share the results with you.
Far and away, we have a landslide.
Yeah, it looks like establishing new workflows and processes is the largest response here, but then we also have about a quarter in each technology and staff buy-in, and about 10% in timeliness and accuracy of data.
Yeah, and I think establishing the workflow and the processes are going to be linked to staff buy-in as well as technology. you know, I mean, I think once you can communicate what the workflows are, then you can go about harnessing your technology, and also you can go about getting staff buy-in, although you should be getting staff buy-in along the way as well.
Yep. So it looks like we have one comment that came through the chat box. So Christopher, his organization is experiencing challenges around moving to a new EHR and limits on what is transferable between those, and also medical diagnoses are only entered if there's a psychiatrist that's assigned.
Yeah, so here's what you're going to find as you're collecting data. This should be a frustrating process if done well, right? So most of the time when you're collecting data and you're beginning to benchmark progress over time, you're going to find that either you've got a data entry problem, you're not collecting the data that you want to be collecting, or you know, there's some hole in your methodology. And so recognize and be patient with yourselves, be patient with your organization, that is going to be common practice. You know, the EHR pieces, those are, you know, I think that one of the great lessons here is thinking with the end in mind. So as opposed to thinking about how this is a nightmare, I'm sure it's so frustrating when you're doing an EMR implementation. I've done it myself. I hear you. But it's also an opportunity. So if as you're just identifying your algorithm for risk stratification and you're setting up workflows in a new EHR, you can set it up so that you're collecting the process level data that you need within discrete fields, so that going forward you have easily attainable reports that you can pull. So I think, you know, while it's certainly a barrier, it's also an amazing opportunity to really rework something. And so happy to talk that through further as well if you're interested on your affinity group calls, and I will be on those as well.
Yep. The project manager side of me is also just thinking about the fact that good planning will really help you not completely overcome the barriers. There's always going to be barriers, but like mitigating some of the challenges, thinking through it in advance, and eliminating some of the headaches. And so, you know, we're actually, of course, we're moving into our next section. If we go to the next slide, which is really around planning.
Looks like we have someone with a raised hand. Darla, I'm going to unmute you so you can contribute. You're unmuted now. Darla Boothman. Darla?
You might be muted on your end.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there you are.
Okay. I just was going to make a comment on our plan, the slide that you had about the low-hanging fruit, and who's going to collect what and how we're going to do that. We went for metrics that we were already collecting. We identified something we're collecting the metrics, but we weren't doing any measuring on them. So we kind of went from the middle of what are we already collecting, how do we want to measure it?
Yep.
And then defining that multiple people in the implementation group will be able to run the data reports that they'll need to make it easier for everybody to access all the data.
So what's amazing about that is that you've got a long history of a baseline.
Yes.
And so if I'm hearing you correctly, then the next challenge is, well, first operationalizing that. How do we ensure that that there's a workflow and a procedure around the data collection, but then also getting staff buy-in by setting a goal with your folks on how you're going to either, depending on the metric, either increase things over time or decrease something over time. Is that accurate?
Yes. We want to decrease.
What are you working
on? Some things over time. Well, one of our goals is identifying our high-risk clients in both mental health and SUD to make sure that they are getting their the proper amount of care coordination and treatment options. Because we know they're being offered services, we just don't know if they're actually receiving the amount that that we feel as a high risk client they should be getting. And we have current assessments in place that track, like their ASAM for the SUD side that puts them at a higher, helps identify their high risk. We have a mental health assessment that comes up with a score for level of need that we can use. And so we're like, okay, this is how we're going to identify them. If they have a score this high or higher on ASAM and this higher or higher on the mental health assessment, that puts them in this high risk category. Now we want to know, are they really getting high risk services, the amount and type that they should be getting? And
so
and
you
if
are
they
doing...
were getting those, sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
If they were getting those appropriate levels of services, we should see a reduction in the number of times that they're going to the emergency room or that they're being referred for inpatient substance use treatment or the days of spent in jail.
You just clearly laid out your logic model.
Yep.
Which is beautiful. You get an A. No, so you clearly thought this through. You identified, clearly were able to articulate what your goal is. You clearly identified what process level measures you are going to be using through the assessment, but then you paired that with outcome level measures around ED visit and hospitalization rates. And then to put it in a different way, you're talking about operationalizing a risk stratification process and then linking that to care pathways.
Yes.
Yay.
And we started, but we did, I just wanted other people to hear though, we started the whole thing based on this is what we know we can get for data and kind of worked out from there. We didn't start with identifying our goal first.
That's a really, really good point. That sometimes it's looking at what it is that you have already, and the fact that you have a long established baseline it will help you to identify what progress you're making and whether your intervention is actually effective. And so I think that's a good answer to what Christopher was asking a minute ago around some of the struggles with your EHR. So don't wait for you to have a complete data set. Start somewhere today.
Yep. I think the other thing that speaks to is using data to drive what your intervention is, right? So this is something you identified that you were able to collect and where you've identified a challenge in using that instead of just making an assumption about, oh, this is what we should focus on, even though we might not have any data to support what we're assuming is a problem.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
And thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else?
Okay. All right.
Okay, so moving from thinking about our log frame and our metrics, and then starting to think about our activities. And so in project management, there's really a phasic approach to planning that we do a useful exercise we'll be undertaking during a subsequent webinar. But really the idea is about before diving in that you're taking the time to think about all of the details in terms of activities, timeline, resources that your stretch project is both comprised of and has the potential to impact your project, and that this is going to be an iterative process. So we're not going to dive in super deep into activities and planning today, but I just want to forecast for you so that you guys know what you're doing now and how it's going to build into what we're going to continue to do. So if we go to the next slide. So when we're thinking about planning, this is really the phases of planning that we like to employ to make sure we're looking at the project as a whole. And thinking about all of the moving resources and all of the moving pieces that could impact the project. And so what we will be working on subsequently is really breaking these down as you are defining your stretch project, and you have your log frame, then saying, okay, what are the activities I need to do? What is my work plan? And so we'll walk through these with you in a subsequent webinar talking about activity definition, so really comprehensively identifying all of the activities that need to be performed to produce your deliverables, sequencing them, so identifying the relationships that exist among those activities which are dependent upon one another, which can happen subsequently. Resource estimation is going to be key here. And so, allocating the type and quantity of resources available and required to perform these activities. And when we're thinking about resources, there's EHRs, there's all those things, but one of the most important ones is your staff, right? Because as we know, there's a lot of change going on. There's a lot of potential burnout. We're adding things. So we want to make sure that as much as possible, we're not overcommitting our staff and we have an understanding of who's available to us if our timelines impact anything else they have going on. Duration estimating, so being realistic about the time it's going to take to complete some of these things and really thinking about that, not just putting some dates to things. And then finally, rolling it all together into your actual project plan. So if we go to the next slide, turning your framework into that action plan, into that work plan. So what you're going to see with this is, as you're looking at this, the easiest way to start thinking about high level what some of the activities you're going to do. Obviously, you thought about some of them, but you're going to really start with your output. Process, when we were talking about process and outcome measures, is the direct work you're doing. So those activities and outputs are going to roll into that process. If we go to the next slide, which is a little bit hard to read, so I apologize, but you'll see that, like, for this example in particular, that high level activity that is then chunked down time and time again, and we will be drilling down even further than this. This is kind of rolled up into a pretty little package, is your log frame output. So that is the result, and those are all of the different moving pieces that are leading to that result. But, when you're really thinking about this now and you're starting to think about the activities that need to be happening, also consistently going back about where you should start, what you're trying to accomplish, and how you're going to implement it. And you can see in here, even data collection is in of itself its own set of activities that really overlaps with everything else. So then next slide. And then once you have those activities in place, it's really going and implementing them through a rapid cycle change process. So if we go to the next slide, and I'm assuming that a lot of you are really familiar with rapid cycle change. I feel like it's a buzzword that's been thrown around a lot, but really it's that systematic approach to understanding needs, restructuring processes, and making the most efficient use of our resources. So understanding, trying, seeing if it works out, and then if it doesn't, or if it's not in the most efficient way, then consistently refining it. And if we go to the next stage, so when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about kind of 4 steps. It's a plan, do, study, act, right? And actually, it's funny because if you look at the Medicaid Transformation Demonstration Project Toolkit, there is a whole section on planning that really ties to those 4 pieces. So it's tying again with what's happening at a state level. You're just doing it at a smaller scale. So you're leveraging your transformation plan, but you're developing and executing a smaller scale version of this transformation plan through this stretch project, right? You're developing and executing, instead of the practice transformation plan, you're going to be developing and executing your stretch project work plan. And then once you plan it, you're going to go and do. You're going to be implementing. You're going to be refining. You're going to be looking at it. So that study really happens both during, and a good practice is always after too. So as you do each phase of your work plan, and as you complete little pieces, analyzing them and thinking about, did this work? Did this not work? If not, why not? And doing that alongside your metrics as well. And then, continuously improving upon that. So from what you learn as you study it, incorporating that into the next phases of this. And I think one thing that I want to continue to reiterate there is that it's just all about starting small and growing. So next steps. some things that we want you to work on between now and the next webinar is continuing to refine your log frame and metrics based on today's conversation. And I think we're missing. Okay. And beginning to think about and draft your data collection plan. Who will pull the data? How often? How will it be shared? Who's responsible? And does this change any current workflows? This can really be the pieces that you ask yourself to drive what that data collection plan is. And then the next webinar is going to be December 15th. If you're doing this work, we want you to come prepared to the next webinar with your 2-sentence elevator speech on what your stretch project is. And that's really going to set us up for that next discussion, which is going to be communicating the why. And one process level and one outcome level metric you're going to be tracking on and what your data collection plans for those metrics are. And now I will turn it over to Kate.
So we're going to, by we, I mean Joan is going to be sending out the invites for the affinity groups that are coming up. And so we have, you can see here the different groups. We have taken a look at everybody's logic models or their log frames that they've submitted. And based on those, we've lumped people together into affinity groups so people are going to be focusing on similar topics. So there were a lot of themes that Sam pointed out at the beginning of the hour. The first 3 groups are really focusing in on risk stratification amongst a couple of other things, but that are really linked to risk stratification. And the 4th group is also focusing in on transitions of care. And so we will have coaching, and you bring these questions to those meetings, bring questions that people have to those meetings. We'll also be in those calls talking through the homework that we just gave around the next action items for data, for identifying your metrics and data. And then we'll be talking through that, like lessons learned and what barriers people are experiencing and developing all of that. Also, more to come, we're going to be sending out a planning guide that will hopefully help you guys to think beyond the stretch project and how to incorporate all of the goings on in Washington State, so that you have a thoughtful process to navigate the next couple of years. And that should be coming out to you guys in the next couple of weeks as we're drafting that, and then sending it. It'll be iterative too, and we'll be learning from you guys as you are working on those. So more to come in that front as well. Thank you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand here. And we can answer them. We've got plenty of time for questions if people would like to raise their hand and comment on what they've been experiencing on site as well.
So we do have one question about sending out the PowerPoint. So we will be sending out the PowerPoint. You can also download it in the GoToWebinar panel on the right of your screen in the handout section. So one way or another, you will get it.
And I believe that they're going to also be putting these PowerPoints up on the hub, which is always an area where you can get information about what's going on with the Academy.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Any other questions?
Okay. Anything to add, Kate or Sam, before we sign off?
To me, the only thing to add would just be that I want to just reiterate that you guys have done an amazing job. Sam, I don't know about you, but when I took a look at the log frames, I was super impressed. It was obvious that people spent a significant amount of time on them.
Mm-hmm.
It's obvious that people have been really thoughtful. You know, Darla, your example today means that, to me, what that demonstrates is that you've really been just been really thoughtful about how you're going to measure progress, really thoughtful about how to engage staff, really thoughtful about the activities that you need to take and make in order to be able to have a really clear vision for your stretch project. So thank you guys for all of the hard work that you've done.
Yep. Definitely, I agree.
All right, great. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and I'd like to extend a thank you to Kate and Sam for sharing their expertise today with us. We invite you to complete a brief survey following the webinar. As always, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions, and have a great rest of the day.
Bye, guys.